Hey everyone, Stephanie Skrzowski here. I'm a CFO, Chief Financial Officer, and I'm the founder and CEO of 100 Degrees Consulting. I help leaders of nonprofits and small businesses better understand, use, and communicate their financials. And today, I'm super excited to talk about best-in-class financial management when it comes to grant funding. So we're going to hit on some of the most important points that you should remember both pre and post funding to ensure that you make the most out of those grant funds. We all know that they're super hard to come by and we want to do it right. So let's dive right in. So first of all, the grant finance life cycle. So it's not exactly a step-by-step process. It's really a cyclical process where we start with, here at the top in green, the organizational budgeting and strategic planning. That's the foundation for your organization's work. And so you have to make sure before you start going out applying to grants, you want to make sure that you have your own internal budgeting and strategic planning on point. So then we move on to grant proposals and budgets. So you prepare this proposal, you prepare the accompanying budget, it goes off to the funders. Then next, hopefully you're going to receive that grant. Then you've got to manage those grant funds according to whatever stipulations the funder puts in place. You then have to report on that funding, and then starts the cycle all over again for the next year when you're doing your organizational budgeting and strategic planning. So on the right, we sort of have pre-funding, which we will talk about, and then as we go around the circle to the left, you'll see a couple post-funding, and we will talk about those next. So we really want to make sure that pre-funding, your organization is set up for success. So when we talk about your annual budget and strategic planning for your organization, there are a couple things that I think a lot of nonprofits miss when it comes to preparing your organizational budget. So it's your guide map, your roadmap for planning the year's income and expenses. It should not be changed throughout the year. You don't want to edit your budget just because, a couple things on your expenses, maybe you hired a new person. That should not change your budget. So it should be completed and approved by the board. That second piece is key before you start your fiscal year. You don't want to be 3 to 6 months into the year and then just getting approval. The budget is really a management tool that you want to keep alive and use on a monthly basis. So you want to get that locked in before the start of the fiscal year. It should be done hand in hand with the strategic planning process, because when you're strategic planning, you're really thinking through what you want to achieve in that time period, but you almost always need resources to go along with those deliverables. So you want to make sure the two talk to each other so that you have the resources in your budget to accomplish your strategic plan. And of course, your budget needs to align with your accounting system. It should have the same exact chart of accounts that your accounting system has. You can very easily input it into the accounting system and then report on it. Because if you're not able to report on budget versus actuals, the budget is basically pointless. So your organizational budget, if it's done well, according to what we just talked about, will let us know whether something is realistic. Do we have the money to do this particular project or to hire a new person? It will help with sequencing and planning. So if we know that most of our revenue comes in March, maybe we don't make a big decision or a big investment in January because most of our money is not coming in until a bit later. So it helps with figuring out the timing of different program activities and other things. It serves as a KPI tracking mechanism. So within your budget and within your numbers are a ton of different insights and metrics that you can pull to understand more about the financial health of the organization. And if your organizational budget is done right, it's going to enable really easy grant reporting, because your grant budget will be just a little piece of your bigger organizational budget, but it'll have the same line items, the same chart of account codes, so that it fits in there really, really seamlessly. So this is sort of the foundation. Make sure you have the annual budget and your strategic planning process in place before you dive into grant budgets. Is how much detail do I include on my grant budget? So here's an example of not enough detail. So salaries and benefits, $102,000. Who is that? How many people is that? Is that 5 people each at, 20% FTE, or is that one person? Is that an executive director? Is that a program coordinator? Same with consultant and professional fees. Oops, who is this? What are they doing? And so on and so forth. So what I would do with this one, the suggestions that I would make to this organization are to drop a couple line items below each of these to break out exactly what these expenses are. So here is another example of a good amount of detail. So you'll see we're looking at travel, for example. So instead of saying we're just going to spend $30,000 on travel, we have in-country and regional travel, Ethiopia. We have DSA for humanitarian lead. So these are different trips, number of days, and how much per trip. So I can see here exactly how many trips this person or this organization wants to fund with this grant. Very, very helpful. Okay, so now that you know what to include on the proposal and you've got your organization set up right, you get the grant. That's amazing. You have a new pot of money that you are able to use to deepen your impact and further your programs. But now what, right? You want to make sure that we are managing this money properly. So if your bookkeeping is not already solidified, you need to do that now, because any reports that you put in are useless without good data in there. And good data comes from a solid monthly close process. So what is a solid monthly close process? So first of all, it's timely. You want to close the books for the month within, a week to 2 weeks after the month is over. So if the month is over September 30th, by October 15th or no later than, you really should have the books closed for September. It should be all inclusive. So any expense, any piece of revenue needs to be in there in the accounting system. We don't leave anything out and say, oh, we'll just enter it later. No, we need to be all inclusive. Reconciled. So all of your cash accounts have to be reconciled. There's no way to know if your books are accurate if you don't check what's in the bank account in QuickBooks versus what's actually in the bank accounts on the bank statement without reconciling. So that's really important. And then you have to do the reports, run your income statement, run your balance sheet, run your grant reports if you have any grant budgets in there, and review them on a monthly basis to ensure that you have real-time visibility into your numbers. So if this isn't happening, we need to make sure it's happening. Then if any transactions pop up after the close of the month, you enter them in the next month, because once those books are closed and we have those reports, we don't want to touch them again. Okay, so setting up your accounting system for this specific grant. So you want to input the grant budget into your accounting system if possible. So some accounting systems are more restrictive than others, and you can't always enter multiple budgets for a year into the accounting system. But if you can, I highly recommend you do it, because you're going to be able to do a budget versus actual for that particular grant with a click of a button. And how amazing is that? That's going to help your grant reporting for sure. So if you need to add any line items to the chart of accounts, so for example, maybe you didn't have a line item in there before for airfare, but you know you're going to have to travel and you have airfare in your grant budget. Add that line item to your chart of accounts. Then you want to set up and test your reports to show revenue and expenses by donor. And you want to test them in advance, because you don't want it to be 2 days away from your grantor reporting deadline and you've never run a report before, and then you end up having to do it offline or something crazy. So test some reports. Make sure that you have your accounting system set up so that it's a click of a button or as close as you can get to pull those revenue and expenses by donor. Now, here's an area where I see a lot of organizations get tripped up, and it's around understanding restrictions. And if you've ever had an audit, you know how important it is to make sure that you understand how to book revenue and expenses that are restricted in any way. So I'm going to go over the sort of delineation between these 3 different categories and talk about when you might need to use them. So permanently restricted funds are not that common, and you often find them in an endowment. So for example, many nonprofits will have an endowment, and that endowment itself will be permanently restricted. You can never use the funds that were initially deposited into the endowment. You may use the earnings on those endowed funds, but you can't use the principal itself. So those funds would be permanently restricted. You can never touch them. Temporarily restricted. Now here is where much of your grant funding is going to be temporarily restricted. So this is when a donor or a funder, a grantor, imposes restrictions on how you can use the funds. So I've got a couple of examples on the next slide, but it's usually around purpose or time. So we'll talk about that in a second, the difference between those two. And then unrestricted, of course, is anything else. If your donor says, oh, the funds are for general operating purposes, boom, unrestricted, super easy to manage and to track. So how do you know what's restricted? So that's a very good question. And I will also say that if you ever have any questions, you know who's a great resource is your auditor. They're the ones that are going to be looking at the way that you've booked these funds at the end of the year. And so if you have a question, send them that grant agreement and just ask. Most auditors that I know would be happy to answer the question now rather than having to make a ton of adjusting journal entries at the end of the year. So if we go down to this little red box here, to be used in 2019 and 2020. So what type of restriction is that? Time restriction. The donor is telling you that there are only these 2 years that it may be able to be used in, temporarily restricted. Or the middle blue box for the Rwanda Education Project. Okay, so they don't want this to be used for the Uganda Education Project. It has to be used for the Rwanda Education Project, temporarily restricted for general operating purposes. And this is the one that we all know and love, unrestricted. So hopefully that's helpful in determining, but some language, and you might have to kind of pick through that grant agreement, but there's going to be some language in there that's going to give you a clue as to if it's temp restricted or not. Okay, so how do we track and report on restrictions? And it's very important that we do so. It needs to be done in the accounting system. And also we have to keep a schedule of these temporarily restricted net assets offline as well. So first of all, in your accounting system, if you use QuickBooks, there's a functionality called classes, which is basically just another bucket or another way or a segment of categorizing expenses and revenue. So you can very easily set up a class for, you know, a particular program or a class for a donor. I recommend, you know, choosing one sort of system and keeping that consistent, but there are ways in your accounting system to track these very, very accurately. Now, you also want to have some sort of filing system for your grant agreements. I recommend somewhere in the cloud, either Dropbox or Google Drive or whatever it might be. But I want you to make sure your accounting team has access. And this is really important because a lot of times, maybe your development team doesn't really understand the restrictions or the necessity to be really precise on how we're recording these things. And so when they tell the accountant, hey, we just got this new grant, you know, just book it as unrestricted. Well, maybe there's some like very specific language in there that says, hey, we have to use this in, you know, in Kenya. We can't just use this for any of our programs. But if the accounting staff doesn't know that, they can't book it right. So make sure there's an accessible grant agreement filing system to anybody who needs access. And then finally, how to track and report on these restricted funds. You need to do it on a monthly reconciliation on a temp restricted net asset schedule. This is one of the first things that your auditor is going to ask for. I have a really great template, so if you want to just click below, I can shoot that over to you with some instructions around it because it's a really good one that is easy to use if you're not, you know, even if you're not an Excel guru. So it's really important to keep track of that offline. So click below, you can grab that. So reporting to funders. So when you're thinking about reporting, there are a couple different things that you need to know. So first of all, the format of the report. What does the report look like? Now, a lot of funders will have a template already done for you where you just have to fill in the blank with the numbers. This can be great because then you don't have to create something yourself, but it also means it's going to be a little bit more work than just clicking a button from the accounting system and spitting out a report. So then your content, what data is going into the report? And so when I talk about content, I'm talking about the line item detail. How much detail do they want? Do they want every single line item of the budget, or do they want bigger, sort of categories like personnel and travel? Or do they want to see, airfare, hotels, etc. under travel? So you want to know what content should be included. And finally, the time frame or the time period. So oftentimes, a grant, a funder will want maybe a quarterly report, or maybe they want an annual report, or maybe it's some wacky time period from like July 17th to the following, May 14th. It could be any of those depending on the way the grant is written and what's in there. So just pay attention to those details, because that's really going to help get you the right report the first time and not have the funder kick it back wanting a second revision. So policy and process best practices. So a couple other things you want to consider when you are really making sure that you're managing these grant funds properly is to make sure that you have a finance policy manual or an accounting manual in place, so that anybody who's doing the accounting, whether it's your bookkeeper, your accountant, your CFO, or anybody in between, really understands how we're booking transactions and is doing it consistently across all grants, across the entire organization, making sure that we're recognizing revenue properly, and again, classifying those restrictions as we need to, making sure that expenses are consistently and accurately allocated to programs. So for example, this is something I see a lot is rent. Rent usually gets dumped in a sort of the admin class or, the admin category, but really is potentially allocated out to programs. And so we want to make sure that we're doing that accurately, because rent is often something that is built into grant budgets. We need rent to ensure that we can run our programs. So we want to make sure that those allocations are done accurately. Then internal controls and segregation of duties. So we just want to make sure that the same person, when I'm talking about segregation of duties, the same person is not opening the mail, preparing the deposit, depositing the checks, booking the checks into the accounting system, reconciling the bank accounts, and then running the reports, right? We want different people doing different things to provide some checks and balances around our finance policies and practices. So these are very, very basic best practices that regardless of your grant funding, you should definitely have in place at your organization. So some of the insights that we talked about today that I just want to recap briefly are, number one, to create an organizational budget that aligns with your strategic plan. So this is the foundation for everything and anything that you're going to do at your organization. Then when we're talking about grant budgets, make sure those grant budgets align with your accounting system and your organizational budget. And then include enough detail in there so that you can report on them really accurately later. If those two are not aligned, if your grant budget includes all these wacky categories that don't fit with what you already have existing in your accounting system, you will never be able to report on them. Trust me, I've been there, it's miserable. You want to make sure your bookkeeping is really solid and that you've got a great monthly close process in place so that you can easily do your grant reporting when the time comes. And finally, fourth, you want to accurately track your temp restricted and your unrestricted funds to make sure that your audit is solid and to make sure that you are complying with all of the financial requirements out there, as well as your funder. And finally, fifth, make sure you can generate timely and accurate grant reports, preferably from your accounting system. Even if you then have to pop it into their template, if you have all of the data in your accounting system, it's going to be more accurate, you're going to get it done faster, and your funders are going to be just thrilled with you. So that's all I have for you today. I hope that's really helpful. I hope you got a couple new nuggets of information on how to better both prepare for and manage grant funds. So again, if you want a temporarily restricted net asset schedule template and some instructions, just click the link below and grab it, and hopefully that'll be helpful. Thanks.